I'm delighted to welcome each of you to this important workshop styled Coping with Climate Change and Other Environmental Risks. It used to be called climate change. Of late, it has been described as a climate crisis. And of last week, it was designated a climate emergency. Whatever the name, the situation is grave. In the words of Antoine, the UN Secretary General, climate change is no longer a long-term problem. We are confronted now with a global climate crisis. The point of no return is no longer over the horizon. It is in sight and hurtling towards us. End of quote. Here in the Caribbean, perhaps the Prime Minister of Dominica said it best after experiencing the devastation of Hurricane Maria in 2017, when he said, and I quote, "The Caribbean is on the front line of the war against climate change." End of quote. According to the World Meteorological Organization's latest report, greenhouse gases in the atmosphere hit a record high in 2018, exceeding the average yearly increase of the last decade and reinforcing increasingly damaging weather patterns. And if this sobering fact were not enough, the most recent report by the UNFCCC revealed it has become less likely to cap through emissions management rising temperatures at the proposed 1.5 degrees Celsius. This issue is taking center stage this week at COP25 in Madrid, where valiant efforts will be made once again to rally countries to not just have more climate ambition, but to increase their climate action, to take faster action to deliver on their Paris Treaty Agreement commitments. I want to remind us, and I know I'm speaking to the converted, but for the record, at 2 degrees Celsius, small islands such as ours will be underwater by 2100. And yes, some of you smile and say, well, I will be long gone then. But I wish to remind you, how many of us remember Y2K and all the buzz around Y2K? Well, hello, that was 20 years ago. I put time in perspective for you. So it is not as far away as it seems. According to the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to keep climate change within manageable limits, countries need to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, reach carbon neutrality by 2050, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45% from 2010 levels by 2030. As governor of a small central bank, a group of small island development states, I add my voice in appealing to developed countries to fulfill their commitments under the Paris Agreement and to deliver on their pledge of mobilizing $100 billion annually by 2020 for climate action, particularly for adaptation in small island developing states. For guests who are wondering what we're planning to do at the ECCB, as you drove in, you would have observed our solar carports, and I want to simply say this. As a small central bank, we've determined that we will be carbon neutral by 2022. What you see in front of you, yes, we can take a bow, yes. What you see in front of you is phase 1 of our Greening of the Campus initiative. That will be completed this month. We will then pivot to phase 2, which we expect to complete by June of next year, at which time we project that we would be meeting 60% of our energy needs. We will then press on with additional investments to ensure that we get to our target of carbon neutrality by 2022. What am I saying? Even as small states, even as a small central bank, we can do our part, and we are doing our part to ensure that we make our planet a safer place, not just for ourselves, but our children and grandchildren. And we urge others to do likewise and to do more in this regard. I want to remind us of 3 important facts, and I know I'm speaking to the converted this morning when it comes to climate change, but we need to remember these things. 1, the Caribbean is among the lowest emitters of carbon, but among the hardest hit. 2, the Caribbean is the most tourist-dependent region in the world. And as most of you appreciate, most of our assets, or tourism assets, are along our coasts. So you could understand the vulnerability of that sector to climate risk. And that has direct implications for our banking system and for some of the things that we need to be thinking about in the financial system. And 3, the frequency and ferocity of storms have increased, as evidenced by the monster storms in 2017. But what is more, evidence has indicated that there's not just increased frequency of hurricanes, but that since 2001, we've had 17 of the warmest years on record since 2001. We're in 2019. Every year it's getting hotter and hotter. And last year I was in Europe and I saw that for myself when Europe hit record temperatures in Paris and in Switzerland and in other places as a result of climate change. But I speak to the converted, so let me move on. I want to remind us as well that from a financial system perspective, much is at stake. According to a 2018 Financial Stability Report, the financial system in terms of assets account for 201% of GDP, which is about $40 billion in value. That's what is at risk. That is what is at risk. 200% of our regional GDP. I want to put the number in perspective to help you to understand that what we're doing today and for this week is important not just for the financial system, but the viability of our regional economy, the ECCU. And that when we indicate and when we articulate these needs to our licensees, we need to have a sense of the importance of this and the urgency of this in light of what is at stake. $40 billion in value is at risk. And so, we need to have a call for action. All of us need to ensure, licensees and of course the ECCB, that we fully incorporate climate risk in our risk management frameworks. Here at the ECCB, we have begun to do that. We've been looking at a number of issues, including, for example, gaps in our business continuity plans. We have looked, for example, at the potential rise in non-performing loans and the need for more provisioning as a result of this. Policy wordings of our insurance policies, funding capacity, cooperation agreements among central banks and among commercial banks, and of course the appropriateness of our ECCB standards. These are all things that we are now contemplating or we are looking at, and we will need to refine those as an appropriate response for dealing with this existential threat. What then are my expectations of this workshop? One, that you, regulators, will be equipped with the tools to properly assess and incorporate climate risk in our risk management frameworks. And secondly, that you will have a personal and professional commitment to fight climate change. Yes, folks, we have to have a personal commitment as well. We're all citizens of the planet, and we have to do our part to ensure that we protect it. So in closing, if we are to maintain a strong and resilient financial system, each of us, regulators, supervisors, and of course our financial institutions, must accept responsibility to address the existential threat that is climate change. We must take action now. As you consider the material this week, my hope is that you will also begin to crystallize in your own minds action plans that you can take with you and begin implementation. And I want you to know, from me to you, that the ECCB will be a very strong ally, advocate, and implementer of the smart climate action that are required of our region. Thank you. Have a wonderful week.